To my channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. This is a little blue book. Its cover is in rough shape, but as you can see, it is Little Blue Book number 700, and it is titled A Guide to Schopenhauer, written by Will Durant, PhD. And this is part 4 of the Guide to Schopenhauer. And we left off at the top of page 49. And here we go. Life is evil because the higher the organism, the greater the suffering. For as the phenomenon of will becomes more complete, the suffering becomes more and more apparent. In the plant there is yet no sensibility, and therefore no pain. A certain very small degree of suffering is experienced by the lowest species of animal life. Infusoria and radiata, R-A-D-I-T-A-T-A. No, R-A-D-I-A-T-A. Radiata. Even in insects, the capacity to feel and suffer is still limited, and it first appears in a high degree with the complete nervous system of vertebrate animals, and always in a higher degree the more intelligence develops. Thus, in proportion as knowledge attains to distinctness, as consciousness ascends, pain also increases, and reaches its highest degree in man. And then, again, the more distinctly a man knows, the more intelligent he is, the more pain he has. The man who is gifted with genius suffers most of all. He that increaseth knowledge, therefore increaseth sorrow. Even memory and foresight add to human misery, for most of our suffering lies in retrospect or anticipation. Pain itself is brief. How much more suffering is caused by the thought of death than by death itself? Finally, and above all, life is evil because life is war. Everywhere in nature we see strife, competition, conflict, and a suicidal alternation of victory and defeat. Every species fights for the matter, space, and time of the others. The young hydra, which grows like a bud out of the old one, and afterwards separates itself from it, fights while it is still joined to the old one for the prey that offers itself, so that the one snatches it out of the mouth of the other. But the bulldog ant of Australia affords us the most extraordinary example of this kind, for it is cut in two. A battle begins between the head and the tail. The head seizes the tail with its teeth, and the tail defends itself bravely by stinging the head. The battle may last for half an hour until they die, or are dragged away by other ants. This contest takes place every time the experiment is tried. Young Han relates that he saw in Java a plain as far as the eye could reach, entirely covered with skeletons, and took it for a battlefield. They were, however, merely the skeletons of large turtles, which come this way out of the sea to lay their eggs, and are then attacked by wild dogs, who with their united strength lay them on their backs, strip them off small shells from the stomach, and devour them alive. But often then a tiger pounces upon the dogs. For this these turtles are born. Thus the will to live everywhere preys upon itself, and in different forms is in its own nourishment, till finally the human race because it subdues all others, regards nature as a manufactory for its own use. Yet even the human race revels in itself with most terrible distinctness this conflict, this variance of the will with itself, and we find homo homini lupus. The total picture of life is almost too painful for contemplation. Life depends on our not knowing it too well. If we should bring clearly to a man's sight the terrible sufferings and miseries to which his life is constantly exposed, he would be seized with horror. And if we were to conduct the confirmed optimist through the hospitals, infirmaries, and surgical operating rooms, through the prisons, torture chambers, and slave kennels, over battlefields and places of execution, if we were to open to him all the dark abodes of misery, where it hides itself from the guidance of cold curiosity, and finally allow him to look into the starving dungeons of Ugolino. Never heard of that place. He too would understand at last the nature of this best of all possible worlds. From whence did Dante take the materials of his hell but from our actual world? And yet he made a very proper hell out of it. But when, on the other hand, he came to describe heaven and its delights, he had an insurmountable difficulty before him, for our world affords no materials at all for this. Every epic and dramatic poem can only represent a struggle, an effort, a fight for happiness, never enduring and complete happiness itself. It conducts its heroes through 1,000 dangers and difficulties to the goal. As soon as this is reached, it hastens to let the curtain fall. For now there would remain nothing for it to do but to show that the glittering goal in which the hero expected to find happiness had only disappointed him, and that after his attainment he was no better off than before. We are unhappy married, and unmarried we are unhappy. We are unhappy when alone, and unhappy in society. We are like hedgehogs clustered together for warmth, uncomfortable when too closely packed, and yet miserable when kept apart. It is all very funny, and the life of every individual, if we survey it as a whole, and only lay stress on its most significant features, is really always a tragedy. But gone through in detail, it has the character of a comedy. Think of it. At the age of 5 years, to enter a spinning cotton or other factory, and from that time forth to sit there daily, first 10, then 12, and ultimately 14 years, performing the same mechanical labor, is to purchase dearly the satisfaction of drawing breath. But this is the fate of millions, and that of millions more, in analogous. Let me read that again. But this is the fate of millions, and that of millions more is analogous to it. Again, under the firm crust of the planet dwell powerful forces of nature, which, as soon as some accident affords them free play, must necessarily destroy the crust with everything living upon it, as has already taken place at least 3 times upon our planet, and will probably take place oftener still. The earthquake of Lisbon, the earthquake of Haiti, the destruction of Pompeii, are only small playful hints of what is possible. In the face of all this, optimism is a bitter mockery of men's woes, and we cannot ascribe to the theodicy of Leibniz as a methodical and broad unfolding of optimism any other merit than this, that it gave occasion later for the immortal Candide of the great Voltaire, whereby Leibniz often repeated and lame excuse for the evil of the world, that the bad sometimes brings about the good, received a confirmation which was unexpected by him. In brief, the nature of life throughout presents itself to us as intended and calculated to awaken the conviction that nothing at all is worth our striving, our efforts and struggles, that all good things are vanity, the world in all its end bankrupts, and life a business which does not cover expenses. To be happy, one must be as ignorant as youth. Youth thinks that willing and striving are joys. It has not yet discovered the weary insatiableness of desire and the fruitlessness of fulfillment. It does not yet see the inevitableness of defeat. The cheerfulness and vivacity of youth are partly due to the fact that when we are ascending the hill of life, death is not visible. It lies down at the bottom of the other side. Towards the close of life, every day we live gives us the same kind of sensation as the criminal experiences at every stop on his way to the gallows. To see how short life is, one must have lived long. Up to our 36th year, we may be compared in respect to the way in which we use our vital energy to people who live on the interest of their money. What they spend today, they have again tomorrow. But from the age of 36 onward, our position is like that of the investor who begins to entrench on his capital. It is the dread of this calamity that makes love of possession increase with age. So far from youth being the happiest period of life, there is much more truth in the remark made by Plato at the beginning of the Republic, that the prize should rather be given to old age, because then at least a man is freed from the animal passion which has hitherto never ceased to disquiet him. Pardon me. Yet it should not be forgotten that, when this passion is extinguished, the true kernel of life is gone, and nothing remains but the hollow shell. Or, from another point of view, life then becomes like a comedy which, begun by real actors, is continued and brought to an end by automata dressed in their clothes. At the end we meet death. Just as experience begins to coordinate itself into wisdom, brain and body begin to decay. Everything lingers but for a moment, and hastens on to death. And if death bides its time, it is but playing with us as a cat with a helpless mouse. It is clear that as our walking is admittedly nothing but a constantly prevented falling, so the life of our bodies is nothing but a constantly prevented dying, an ever postponed death. Among the magnificent ornaments and appeal of Eastern despots, there is always a costly vial of poison. The philosophy of the East understands the omnipresence of death, and gives to its students that calm aspect and dignified slowness of carriage, which comes of a consciousness of the brevity of personal existence. The fear of death is the beginning of philosophy, and the final cause of religion. The average man cannot reconcile himself to death, therefore he makes innumerable philosophies and theologies. The prevalence of a belief in immortality is a token of the awful fear of death. Just as theology is a refuge from death, so insanity is a refuge from pain. Madness comes as a way to avoid the memory of suffering. It is a saving break in the thread of consciousness. We can survive certain experiences or fears only by forgetting them. How unwillingly we think of the things which powerfully injure our interest, wound our pride, or interfere with our wishes. With what difficulty do we determine to lay such things before our intellects for careful and serious investigation? In that resistance of the will to allow what is contrary to it to come under the examination of the intellect lies the place at which madness can break in upon the mind. If the resistance of the will against the apprehension of some knowledge reaches such a degree that that operation is not performed in its entirety, then certain elements or circumstances become for the intellect completely suppressed, because the will cannot endure the sight of them, and then, for the sake of the necessary connections, the gaps that thus arise are filled up at pleasure. Thus madness appears, for the intellect has given up its nature to please the will. The man now imagines what does not exist, yet the madness which has thus arisen is lethe of unendurable suffering. It was the last remedy of harassed nature, i.e., of the will. The final refuge is suicide. Here at last, strange to say, thought and imagination conquer instinct. Diogenes is said to have put an end to himself by refusing to breathe. What a victory over the will to live! But this triumph is merely individual, and will continue in the species. Life laughs at suicide, and smiles at death. For every deliberate death, there are thousands of indeliberate births. Suicide, the willful destruction of the single phenomenal existence, is a vain and foolish act. For the thing in itself, the species, and life, and will in general, remains unaffected by it, even as the rainbow endures however fast the drops which support it for the moment may chance to fall. Misery and strife continue after the death of the individual, and must continue. So long as will is dominant in man, there can be no victory over the ills of life, until the will has been utterly subordinated to knowledge and intelligence. Chapter 6. The Wisdom of Life. Part 1. Philosophy. Consider first the absurdity of the desire for material goods. Fools believe that if they can only achieve wealth, their wills can be completely gratified. A man of means is supposed to be a man which means for the fulfillment of every desire. People are often reproached for wishing for money above all things, and for loving it more than anything else. But it is natural, and even inevitable, for people to love that which, like an unwearied Proteus, is always ready to turn itself into whatever object their wandering wishes or their manifold desires may fix upon. Everything else can satisfy only one wish. Money alone is absolutely good, because it is the abstract satisfaction of every wish. Nevertheless, a life devoted to the acquisition of wealth is useless unless we know how to turn it into joy. And this is an act that requires culture and wisdom. A succession of sensual pursuits never satisfies for long. One must understand the ends of life as well as the art of acquiring means. Men are 1,000 times more intent on becoming rich than on acquiring culture, though it is quite certain that what a man is contributes more to his happiness than what he has. A man who has no mental needs is called a Philistine. He does not know what to do with his leisure, difficultus in otii quaes. To do with his, He searches greedily from place to place for new sensations, and at last he is conquered by the nemesis of the idle rich, or the reckless voluptuary innumeri. Not wealth, but wisdom is the way. Man is at once impetuous striving of will, whose focus lies in the reproductive system, and eternal, free, serene, subject of pure knowledge, of which the focus is the brain. Marvelous to say, knowledge, though born of the will, may yet master the will. The possibility of the independence of knowledge first appears in the indifferent way in which the intellect occasionally responds to the dictates of desire. Sometimes the intellect refuses to obey the will, e.g., when we try in vain to fix our minds upon something, or when we call in vain upon the memory for something that was entrusted to it. The anger of the will against the intellect on such occasions makes its relation to it and the difference of the two very plain. Indeed, vexed by this anger, the intellect sometimes occasionally brings what was asked of it hours afterward, or even the following morning, quite unexpectedly and unseasonably. From this imperfect subservience the intellect may pass to domination. In accordance with previous reflection, or a recognized necessity, a man suffers or accomplishes in cold blood what is of the utmost and often terrible importance of him. Suicide, execution, the duel, enterprises of every kind, fraught with danger to life, and in general, things against which his whole animal nature rebels. Under such circumstances we see to what an extent reason has mastered the animal nature. This power of the intellect over the will permits of deliberate development. Desire can be moderated or quieted by knowledge, and above all by a determinist philosophy which recognizes everything as the inevitable result of its antecedents. Of 10 things that annoy us, 9 would not be able to do so if we understood them thoroughly in their causes, and therefore knew their necessity and true nature. For what bridle and bit are to an unmanageable horse, the intellect is for the will in man. It is with inward as with outward necessity. Nothing reconciles us so thoroughly as distinct knowledge. The more we know of our passions, the less they control us, and nothing will protect us from external compulsion so much as the control of ourselves. Si vis tibiae omnia subgere te rationali. The greatest of all wonders is not the conqueror of the world, but the subduer of himself. So philosophy purifies the will, but philosophy is to be understood as experience and thought, not as mere reading or passive study. The constant streaming in of the thoughts of others must confine and suppress our own, and indeed in the long run paralyze the power of thought. The inclination of most scholars is a kind of fuga vacui from the poverty of their own minds, which forcibly draws in the thoughts of others. It is dangerous to read about a subject before we have thought about it ourselves. When we read, another person thinks for us. We merely repeat his mental process. That's interesting. So it comes about that if anyone spends almost the whole day in reading, he gradually loses the capacity for thinking. Experience of the world may be looked upon as a kind of text to which reflection and knowledge form the commentary. Where there is a great deal of reflection and intellectual knowledge, and very little experience, the result is like those books which have on each page 2 lines of text to 40 lines of commentary. The first counsel, then, is life before book, and the second is text before commentary. Read the creators rather than the expositors and the critics. Only from the authors themselves can we receive philosophic thoughts. Therefore, whoever feels himself drawn to philosophy must seek out its immortal teachers in the still sanctuary of their own works. One work of genius is worth 1,000 commentaries. Within these limitations, the pursuit of culture, even through books, is valuable because our happiness depends on what we have in our heads rather than on what we have in our pockets. Every fame is folly. Other people's heads are a wretched place to be, the home of a man's true happiness. What one human being can be to another is not a very great deal in the end. Everyone stands alone, and the important thing is who it is that stands alone. The happiness which we receive from ourselves is greater than that which we obtain from our surroundings. The world in which a man lives shapes itself chiefly by the way in which he looks at it. Since everything which exists or happens for a man exists only in his consciousness and happens for him alone, the most essential thing for a man is the constitution of his consciousness. Therefore it is with great truth that Aristotle says, to be happy means to be self-sufficient. The way out of the evil of endless willing is the intelligent contemplation of life, and converse with the achievements of the great of all times and countries. It is only for such loving minds that these great ones have lived. Unselfish intellect rises like a perfume above the faults and follies of the world of will. Most men never rise above viewing things as objects of desire, hence their misery. But to see things purely as objects of understanding is the rise to freedom. When some external cause or inward disposition lifts us suddenly out of the endless stream of willing and deliveries, knowledge out of the slavery of the will, the attention is no longer directed to the motives of willing, but comprehends things free from their relation to the will, and thus observes them without personal interest, without subjectivity, purely objectivity, gives itself entirely up to them so far as they are ideas, but not in so far as they are motives. Then all at once the peace which we were always seeking, but which always fled from us on the former path of the desires, comes to us of its own accord, and it is well with us. It is the painless state which Epicurus prized as the highest good and as the state of the gods. For we are for the moment set free from the miserable striving of the will. We keep the Sabbath of the penal servitude of willing. The will of Ixion stands still. Part 2. Genesis. Genesis is the highest form of the will-less knowledge. The lowest forms of life are entirely made up of will, without knowledge. Man in general is mostly will and little knowledge. Genius is mostly knowledge and little will. Genius consists in this, that the knowing faculty has received a considerably greater development than the service of the will demands. This involves some passage of force out of reproductive into intellectual activity. The fundamental condition of genius is an abnormal predominance of sensibility over irritability and reproductive power. Hence the enmity between genius and woman, who represents reproduction and the subjugation of the intellect to the will to live and make live. The will to live and make live, yeah. Women may have great talent, but no genius, for they always remain subjective. Wow. It's a pretty rude statement. With them, everything is personal and is viewed as a means to personal ends. On the other hand, genius is simply the completest of objectivity, i.e., the objective tendency of the mind. Genius is the power of leaving one's own interest, wishes, and aims entirely out of sight, of entirely renouncing one's own personality for a time, so as to remain pure, knowing subject, clear vision of the world. Therefore, the expression of genius in a face consists in this, that in it a decided predominance of knowledge over will is visible. In ordinary countenances, there is a predominant expression of will, and we see that knowledge only comes into activity under the impulse of the will, and is directed merely by motives of personal interest and advantage. Freed from all will, the intellect can see the object as it is. Genius holds up to us the magic glass in which all that is essential and significant appears to us, collected and placed in the clearest light, and what is accidental and foreign is left out. Thought pieces through passion as sunlight pours through a cloud and reveals the heart of things. It goes behind the individual and particular to the Platonic idea, or universal essence of which it is a form, just as the painter sees in the person whom he paints not merely the individual character and features, but some universal quality and permanent reality for whose unveiling the individual is only a symbol and a means. The secret of genius, then, lies in the clear and impartial perception of the objective, the essential, and the universal. It is this removal of the personal equation which leaves the genius so maladapted in the world of willful, practical, personal activity. By seeing so far, he does not see what is near. He is imprudent and queer, and while his vision is hitched to a star, he falls into a well. Hence, partly the unsociability of the genius. He is thinking of the fundamental and universal, the eternal. Others are thinking of the temporary, the specific, the immediate. His mind and theirs have no common ground and never meet. As a rule, a man is sociable just in the degree in which he is intellectually poor and generally vulgar. The man of genius has his compensations and does not need company so much as people who live in perpetual dependence on what is outside them. And I think we'll end there for part 4. See you in part 5.